All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar today on unlocking insights with US branch data. I am Jen Miller, I'm your host and the CRO at OpenCorporates. I'm joined today by an excellent panel. We have Chris Taggart, the founder of OpenCorporates, Nick Wright, our VP of Data, and Anna Munoz, one of our data journalists. We have some excellent content for you today, but first, as always, a few bits of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared within 24 hours. Please ask questions in the side panel throughout, as we will have a Q&A at the end. And if you want your question to be directed at a particular panelist, please include their name in your question. To get started, Chris, can you please explain why you started OpenCorporates and this focus on legal entities?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Actually, I was speaking at on the panel at the Corporate Registers Forum in Qatar about a week and a half ago, and something that got tweeted out. It seems an obvious thing to me, but got broadcast quite a lot, which was I called this legal entity data the most important data set in the world, and I genuinely believe that's the case. You know, the whole of commerce, any nation's GDP is about contracts between companies. That's the vast majority of any commercial activity. Of course, we have complex supply chains and other things, but essentially, you know, business is legal entities contracting with other legal entities, controlling other legal entities, producing staff, having assets, liabilities, employing people, and so on. And there is no commercial activity these days without legal entities. People often talk about companies and legal entities as if they're the same thing. And you know, back actually nearly 14 years ago, when I started OpenCorporates with Rob, we had a different perspective, and that different perspective has become stronger over time and has become more recognized over time, which is that, you know, you know, there is no such thing as Microsoft. Microsoft is hundreds of different legal entities that relate to each other, work together in a systematic way. You know, you don't have a contract with Microsoft. You have it with Microsoft Corporation or Microsoft UK Limited or whatever. And this is the actual legal reality. And if you're doing business with another company, then you need to know what that legal entity is. And you need to make sure that that legal entity exists, and you know where it's incorporated, you know what the status is, and so on. And that's why this official record of the existence, the creation, and the existence of legal entities is so important, because otherwise it's a bit like you know, you're dealing with a picture of somebody. You know, you're not dealing with somebody. You can't touch them, and so on. You're just dealing with a picture, an image of them, and so on. And the legal reality is that, you know, whenever you enter into a contract, it's a contract between counterparties that have legal personality. And in the business world, that means legal entities. And companies are things where you ask people on the street what a company means. They talk about something that's doing business. They talk about something that's selling, manufacturing, providing services, and so on and so forth. But we know that, you know, and many, of course, when you set up a company, when you create a company, you want to start this business, you'll need a legal entity in order to conduct it. But legal entities are also used for many, many other purposes, for separating profits from losses, for holding IP, for money laundering, for fraud, for to shield assets from courts, and so on. And so, you know, one of the challenges is that we have this. We talk about companies, but actually we're talking about legal entities, and we're not using this data properly, and we're not understanding it. And you know, a prime example has been, I think, you know, let's say the US federal government, where between 230 to 520 billion a year is lost in fraud and wrongful payments. And generally, the US federal government doesn't have a great understanding of the legal entities with which it's doing business. And that means it doesn't really know who it's paying. It doesn't really know who it's contracted with and so on. And so this category error, as we call it, is one that's allowed lots of bad things to happen. And one of the things that's changed when we started OpenCorporates nearly 14 years ago, we understood this to be the case. And what's happened is that more and more people have understood that. And that's why our data's become very popular. And one of the things is we started on this perspective when it was very unpopular. And we also said we would only get the data direct from the original sources because that was the proof of life. That was the proof of existence of companies. And so that's been our exclusive focus for over 12, 13 years. And along the way, we've learned an awful lot. And I think this is going to be the first of a series of webinars where we're sharing some of the things that we've learned along the way to help people understand the world better, understand risk better, and understand opportunities better. Have to take questions at the end. But Jen, is any things I've missed there?
No, I think that's perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. And now we'll hand over to Nick to talk specifically about US branch data and how it fits into this picture.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, very pleased to kind of cover this topic today. We're going to be looking into US branch data or US foreign LLC data. What does it mean? We're going to be looking across the key insights that we've been able to determine from our data, as well as background trends over the last 5 to 10 years, which we believe is either driving foreign LLC or foreign qualification, as it's called, or domestic incorporation, respectively. We're going to talk a little bit about how we at OpenCorporates actually handle this data. How do we ascertain whether something is a branch? How do we determine the parent of the branch? We will be looking at some of the use cases of this branch data, although some of you, I'm sure, would have already made great use of it already. Ours will just be illustrative and hopefully prompt some exploratory thinking, creative thinking from you. We're very keen to hear more from you on that front as well. And as we said, there'll be a Q&A towards the end as well. So when we talk of US branch data, what exactly are we talking about? In the US, branches are typically known as foreign LLCs. They are not in and of themselves their own legal entities per se. They're extensions of a parent company. It would be analogous to opening another office and essentially it has no further legal standing than its parent. It's in that sense, in contrast, for example, to a subsidiary, which would have a slightly different legal standing. It's its own company. It would typically be able, therefore, to have its own distinct business purpose from the parent. It might be wholly or partly owned by the parent company, but it would be separately incorporated. Now, in the US, there are some strict rules which drive the kind of foreign LLC or what's called foreign qualification. Typically, the primary driver is the fact that you intend to or are already doing business in that state in which you foreign qualify. Doing business, for those that have sort of looked into foreign LLCs, is a particularly vague and not particularly well-defined term. Generally speaking, it implies that you have a physical presence in the state. In that case, you would certainly need to qualify. A physical presence would be something like an office or a warehouse or other sort of buildings. It would also entail if you have any employees hired in the state. I think any more than one would qualify you to set up as a foreign LLC in that state. Recently, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this, there's been something known as an economic nexus, which is also a driver of foreign LLC. and increasingly as well, some compliance regarding licensing, regulatory changes in the way that states work is also significantly driving the requirement to qualify as a foreign legal entity. There are some things that we also know from looking across some of the statutes of the secretaries of state within the US that definitely wouldn't qualify as doing business. So if you wanted to engage in litigation, holding meetings, maintaining bank accounts, any sort of advertising or smaller transaction volumes would not be sufficient necessarily in and of itself to justify it. But there's a whole host of reasons which would drive this. So when we look at what actually happens when you decide that you do need to qualify in a foreign state, you would typically be required to register under the same name as your parent, or there would be a strong incentive to do so. Unfortunately, that name might occasionally be taken if you haven't trademarked that particular name. That might be more likely than if you have, obviously. You would then be required to register a fictitious name, but you would certainly always have to refer back to your parent company's home or domestic jurisdiction. And you would also typically have to provide evidence of the good standing of that parent. We know that actually in and of itself is a very strict criteria across the board. There might be some additional qualifications that you might need to, or additional considerations depending on the state itself. Typically, there's also a fee to be paid. As many of you already be aware, there are certain jurisdictions that are particularly favourable, and we'll be talking about what those sort of conditions would be that would drive either foreign qualification or domestic incorporation as options. But generally, what we have seen in terms of the trends and what Anna will be demonstrating in some of her use cases in a little bit are branches, foreign LLC qualification can be really strong indicators of when companies are either intending to or in the process of moving from planning to execution in their particular growth. It's definitely a sign of organic growth, both in terms of employees, but increasingly in terms of sales, even for internet companies, and we'll see why that is in a minute. In general, just understanding the scope of the company, where they are focused within the US, clearly is a strong indicator. But it might also indicate, it might indicate, depending on how it's set up, that there are significant risk factors. So an example here would be if you've got a branch that is active, but the parent has either itself dissolved or is no longer in good standing with its domestic jurisdiction, that would be a clear risk sign. So you could use your branch and parent data or our branch and parent data to be able to infer if there are significant fraud or other sorts of questionable risk factors. So what are the trends that are driving the foreign qualification, at least in recent times? So one of the ones that I think some of you will definitely be aware of are the trends towards statewide data privacy and consumer protection acts. So this started with the California Consumer Privacy Act and the Privacy Rights Act, both in 2020, but that's only grown over the past several years, just to give a few additional ones that have cropped up just literally in the last few years. So I think what we're seeing is a significant trend for that continuing. There's no similar equivalent federal mandate likely. We've actually confirmed this with several secretaries of state themselves. They've said it's extremely unlikely that that would come from a federal source in any case. What that will mean, of course, is that each of these states themselves will feel obligated increasingly due to consumer pressure, and also, I guess, to some extent, viewing across the pond, the GDPR, similar kind of rules that have been brought into place by the EU towards doing their own version of this. It makes things definitely a lot more complicated if you're on the ground making these decisions. But what this really means, the reason why this is driving foreign qualification, is if you're capturing a certain amount of the residents' consumers' data, or if you're making money out of the consumer's data in that state, increasingly you're going to be liable for qualifying there and essentially registering a foreign LLC in that state. So there's typically a threshold of the number of data points you might be capturing, or the sensitivity of the data you might be capturing, and obviously the revenue potential that you're looking to extract from it. But the net impact is towards increasing foreign qualification, as opposed to potentially previously this being a little bit more hands-off. We see this definitely driving towards more foreign qualification, additional bureaucratic and legal red tape, obviously, behind that. So that's one driving factor. Another one is what's known now as economic nexus laws. Again, these are statewide. The graph here is from avalara.com, but fundamentally what it shows is in a remarkably short space of time since 2018, a majority of states have come up with their own version of economic nexus laws. So where did this originate? It was a landmark Supreme Court case between the South Dakota and Wayfair, the online furniture retailer. It was deliberately brought with a view to trying to change the way in which states were allowed to tax internet companies, internet retailers. Previously, up until this landmark case, it was generally the case that they were not able to extract sales tax from these internet retailers, despite some estimates being as high as 13 billion in sales tax being lost. They were not able to recoup it. As a result of this case being in favor of South Dakota, many have kind of looked at this as a sort of license to proceed and produce their own economic nexus laws. So what this means for companies is if you are if you ever have a certain transaction volume or a certain revenue threshold that you meet, you're very likely going to fall foul of the individual states' laws, and if you don't foreign qualify, you might be subject to fines or other lawsuits coming your way, much like Wayfair did. So this is forcing, again, companies to consider very heavily foreign qualification, especially those that are growing and performing well within the market. In addition to some of those more recent trends, we are seeing significant changes in state legislation to become more tax favorable. We'll talk about that more in a minute. In particular, Wyoming, we're noticing as a standout here. We'll see how that appears in our data in just a moment. But in addition, another sort of modern trend is towards digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, payment processing services. You might think here of Stripe or Google Wallet or Apple Pay, for example. Any of those, they again are due to financial regulations being forced to register as a foreign LLC in almost every state, or domestically incorporate as the alternative. That again is down to the strict regulation for anyone performing financial services. So if you look in a moment, and I'll be showing how that varies by industry, and there's a very, very clear trend in that direction. Finally, I think we have seen some evidence that, for example, during COVID, when remote working became more popular, that might have also driven some foreign qualification, simply because employees found that they could drift more away from maybe their home jurisdiction, their home state, live out of state as need be, maybe be hired out of state. That seems to have loosened people up a little bit towards that. And of course, if you've got employees anywhere outside of the state in which you're based, you're going to have to foreign qualify there as well. Looking at the other side of the coin, what's driving considerations for companies to incorporate domestically? So if you're foreign qualifying, you're domestically essentially incorporated somewhere else. What makes you choose one state as opposed to another, right? So you're going to have to domestically incorporate somewhere, where should it be, is your question. And then the secondary question is where else am I going to have to qualify as a foreign LLC if I intend to grow? So what's driving this? So obviously, if you're deciding that you want to be a much bigger company, one of the key decisions is where do you set up shop? There are lots of push and pull factors here to consider. What you can see on this slide are just some of the ones that that you may or may not be familiar with. Some kind of try and tempt companies with lower fees or much more simplified compliance. You might think here of Delaware in terms of the compliance thing. Also corporate law specialization, notoriously Delaware, very strong on corporate law specialization, which obviously favors people registering there. On the other hand, there are more incentives in favor of waiving personal income tax or residency requirements, which are sometimes quite strict in other jurisdictions. We've even seen state grants, loans, and other rewards in favor of you domestically incorporating with there. Bear in mind that a company always has the choice of either foreign qualifying and remaining under the parent, or potentially domestically incorporating in multiple jurisdictions and simply having them as separate companies that are otherwise owned between each other. It's a different arrangement, and depending on the tax incentives, depending on a number of other things on this screen, you might pick one route versus another. When we're talking of branches in our data, it's very strictly about the foreign LLC dimension, but there are other models that people may pick for different reasons. It really is down to their own circumstances and choices. All right, so I thought we'd spend a little bit of time just trying to understand how OpenCorporates ourselves kind of deal with this data. So we have a as anyone that's using our data knows, principle that we only acquire data fresh, direct from primary registry sources. So in the case of the US, this is the Secretaries of State themselves. We will get that data as near as possible to when they themselves are registering these entities. So we're getting that in lots of different methods. There'll be APIs that we call on. There'll be files that we'll be purchasing, and in some cases where we have no other option, we will be scraping that data as well. Sometimes that's often the fastest way to get the data, I should mention. After we get that data from source, we're going to be mapping it to our core standardized data model. Those that are using it will understand that we're using quite standard fields. So we coerce really very different data models from source into one singular data model that is given back to you. In the case of foreign LLCs, we're able to determine quite with a high degree of accuracy whether a legal entity is a foreign LLC. There will typically be something in the entity type or the company type that tells us this. Another key giveaway is if the jurisdiction mentioned is not the domestic jurisdiction that we're sourcing from. In that case, of course, it will be the home jurisdiction of the parent, which, as I said, is mandatory. So either one or both criteria allows us to flag foreign LLCs. And then once we know it's a branch, we look for the domestic jurisdiction that is mentioned. That will typically be in the form of an address or a state or a code. And based on that, knowing that it's a branch, knowing that where the domestic parent is, we then reconcile to the equivalent company name in the domestic jurisdiction in order to match the two together and create a parent-branch relationship. Now, this relationship is something that's modeled, and you may have seen on our website, but it's also available in API, and most recently we have provided this in a neat format for those purchasing our bulk product. So now there is a specific relationship supplement that allows you to specifically extract the relationships between parents and their branches. We have this not only for the US, I should say, but also globally. I would say that the richness in the US data is particularly strong, and our confidence in the matching is particularly strong. So what does this amount to? Well, in the US, globally, we have around 12.5 million branches. We also, like I say, in the relationship file, capture a few other relationships, subsidiaries from the SEC data, share parcel data from various registry sources themselves, and particularly interesting is the control statements data from the UK Companies House, persons of significant control. All of this together gives us about 31 million relationships that we're able to confidently assert between different entities. Right, so when we look at our data, what can we ascertain as to the trend that we're seeing in the actual numbers? So I talked about some of the trends that we've seen in the background that's going on in the news. You may have read yourselves. What is the data showing? So as you can see on here, there are some standout jurisdictions in terms of where the majority of branches are based. We felt it important to overlay the kind of census data within the US to put some context behind this, because it's trivially true to say that California has the most branches, but it's also the most populous state. So what we're looking for here is how many branches do we have per capita as a indicator of, you know, an over-indexing of that particular state. Interestingly, it's District of Columbia, so this is Washington DC, that has the highest number of branches per capita, followed not so far behind by Wyoming, and then, you know, some of these other ones I might mention before, but Wyoming, Vermont, notorious for being particularly attractive for foreign qualification. I think North Dakota was somewhat of a surprise. Maybe some of you might have some opinions as to why that might be, but it's always interesting to kind of look at it from this angle. As regards the most popular for parent companies, it will surprise probably none of you that Delaware comes out on top, both for total number and per capita. It's after all not a particularly large state, so that is perhaps less surprising. But like I've been saying, Wyoming is close behind, and what the data here somewhat masks, and what we've looked at recently, is that although that number already looks high for Wyoming, if you look at it just in the past year or two, it actually exceeds Delaware per capita in terms of domestic incorporation. So I think that's an interesting trend, again, driven by their more favorable tax setup and corporate kind of incentives that we discussed earlier. Again, DC appears quite popular there as well. I should mention as well that although it may seem obvious that Delaware has this, it's not always the best move. You know, we're not making any, this is not legal advice by any means, but it's my understanding that it can actually be quite a lot of overhead administratively to set up outside of your actual domestic state. It shouldn't be seen as something that is a standard means of registering any particular company unless you intend to grow significantly. It may not really make a lot of sense. Right, so with that, I'm going to have a little bit of an intro to the kind of use cases that we feel, and again, this is just our perception, it's really many of you that are going to be experts on this, some ideas of how we might use that foreign LLC data. So we can think of several cases of where business intelligence and strategy could be informed by this, whether it's analyzing competitor behavior in terms of geographic expansion, for example, getting early signals as to intent. You can also use name reservations for this as a sign of intent. But it might also inform decision making for, you know, more internal mergers or new office locations. From a compliance, KYB, and risk monitoring perspective, you know, has that legal entity registered when they should in the foreign LLC sense? Have they kept up-to-date filings, both in terms of the branches and, of course, the parent in which they do business? Are there any gaps that might cause compliance risks where they are doing business that haven't registered? Obviously, is the domestic company itself in good standing, right? Have they kept up with their filings? Are they active? Fairly obvious ones, but nevertheless important. And from a fraud point of view, looking for shell companies, looking for front businesses, looking for high-risk branches with no or lapsed parent companies. We have a potential example here, but I know some of our customers are particularly well versed in this particular set of use cases. And I'd like at this point to hand over to Anna, who is our data journalist here at OC, and who will be describing some examples of these use cases that we've seen in our data. Anna, over to you.
Hello, happy to be here. And yeah, as said, I'm going to be sharing some examples of uses that you can do with this product. I'm unfortunately experiencing some technical issues, so
all right, just give me a second. I will take back control.
You could also
we'll move on to the next.
Just a quick note, just reshare your screen with the presentation.
Oh, that wasn't my intent. Nope.
Sorry, we can't get away with a webinar without one technical challenge, but thank you all.
I've lost the, here we are. Show this one through. Okay, all right. How about now, Anna? Does that help?
Yeah, I can definitely see the screen now. So we've taken one example, one company, and we are going to trace its growth in time and across the US. So Stripe, which is payment processing software, Nick was mentioning it before, it's currently one of the largest private fintech. So it incorporated in Delaware in 2010. Then 2 years later, it opened its first branch in California with the name of Stripe Payments. But it didn't last long. 2013, it actually closed, and only to reopen again in 2014, along with Maryland. Actually, we've seen that this is a common issue. Companies that close down only to reopen again in the same year or in the following year. And many times it's just related to a change in the name. 2015, it goes from 2 to 9 branches. 16, it's already 14. Next year, 15. And here we come to 2019, where Stripe had a huge breakthrough. They more than doubled its branches, reaching 38 states. 2024, actually nothing that much happened between those 2 years. We will get back to that. As you can see in this example, the Kansas branch actually closed down, and you may have noticed also that the Montana leaf had changed. It is, as we were saying before, another case of an office that had to close down in 2021 because actually the license was revoked due to because they did not renew the name, and they reopened in 2023. So just by looking at the OpenCorporates data, we had, this is what we were seeing, and we got leads that took us into questions and to actually search into why the Montana office closed down or didn't close down. So it's definitely a very good tool to ask questions and to begin any research. Here's another approach to geographical analysis. Here we took a sample of 100 companies, each with 49 branches or more, and we tried to understand if their industry, if their business activity actually affects how they expand geographically. As you can see, financial services, so credit counseling, debt collection, insurances is the outlier. They have more, they were out in the sample, they were more represented than any other sector. And on locations here, we traced where the parent companies are. And as you see, not everyone incorporates in Delaware. There's actually a big variety that also changes from sector to sector. Again, this is only regarding one sample, but it's already a good way of asking questions. Here we're going to one more example. This is the third one. We are going to compare the history and the journey of two companies that you all probably know, also in the technological sphere. And we're going to track them to monitor their growth and link them to regulatory changes. So as you can see, in their early years, same as Stripe, but earlier in the decade, Google and Facebook incorporated in Delaware and very quickly opened a branch in California. Here, okay, 2024, 2026, sorry, one state that you see that both have in common is Michigan. And while we don't know the reasons, what we know is that Michigan at the time was not requiring to identify the members or the managers of LLCs, just as Delaware. This could have been an advantage for Google, not for Facebook, which was corporate. Also, Google was earlier before it was also a corporate, so not sure if this was a reason, but it's a good lead. 2011, what happened here actually? 2006 and 2018, Virginia and North Carolina, they both adopted regulations that were favorable for data centers. So maybe this was one of the reasons for them to open an office there. Here we continue. As you see, they follow a similar growth. 2017, this is an interesting year because both of them, they closed down offices only to reopen them again. In the case of Google, it was up to 9 offices. And why? And also they opened many more offices. Why this expansion? Well, one of the reasons could be that the Tax Cuts and Job Act passed on that year, which reduced corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%. And also around this time, there was more antitrust scrutiny, so which maybe led to some restructuring on the part of these companies. Same as with Stripe, nothing much happened between 2019, 2024. Could be related with the economic nexus laws that Nick was mentioning before, but it also coincides in time with the Consumer Protection Acts and GDPR. Another common trend is that nor Stripe, nor Google, nor Facebook have ever opened an office in Alaska. But well, actually, Alaska seems to have like some. It's not such a bad place from a tax perspective to open an office in Alaska. So We don't know the reason, but that's a fact. And here we go to our fourth story, this time focusing on fraud detection. So here what we did is look into a money laundering case from 1999, where two people, a banker and her husband, were illegally moving funds from Russia to the US through two different companies, Benex International and Bex International. They were actually later pled guilty and were convicted to probation. So if we check these companies, the names in OpenCorporates website, we already see that there are two entities in two different states and apparently not related. One in New Jersey and the other one in Delaware. When we check the one in Delaware, we see that it has an unassigned agent, but actually in Delaware, it is mandatory to have an agent unless you have your own address registered there. And actually, there are many, many more companies and entities who have an unassigned agent. This doesn't mean that all of them are cases of fraud. It maybe means that at least some of them are not active. But well, here you have like another way that can help you to trace entities and try to trace fraud cases. And with this, I'm going to hand it back to Nick, who is also going to continue talking a little bit about fraud.
It's really just one further case I wanted to potentially highlight. Before I speak about this one, I want to emphasize that we don't know for sure what the situation is, but what we do know is that essentially we have a record, in this case Chipmunk Mining LLC, which is registered as a branch within Alaska, as you can see on the left, and that references a parent company in Colorado. Unfortunately, although we're able to validate the branch by checking the record in the middle of the screen that you see here, and that appears to be in good standing, what we are seeing is that there's no equivalently named or anything even similarly named parent within Colorado, as far as we can tell. We did attempt to look around similar address, similar named individuals, didn't appear to find anything. Now, there's no particular evidence beyond this that we have that this is fraud, but it would certainly open up a question. In this case, our preferred approach would be to raise the query with the respective registries themselves, see if they have further evidence one way or the other. Maybe this is not something they're aware of. We know for sure that sometimes validating whether a parent company remains in good standing or is initially in good standing can actually be quite a challenge for some of these secretaries of state, depending on which other states they're talking to. Now, again, no implication being thrown, but it's at the very least a DQ issue that is nevertheless valid, points at a potential gap. And if you were looking for red flags, suspicion of fraud, this might be something that would raise an eyebrow. So just a few different examples of the kinds of use cases to which we could see the foreign LLC data being put. And with that, I wanted to make sure we allowed enough time for any questions. I have not got visibility over the questions, so maybe Jen, over to you if there's ones that you've seen come up.
Yes, so thank you, Nick and Anna. I think there's some great examples to just show how you can see how businesses are growing, what changes in regulation mean both from a state level, but also for different industries and where they're setting up branches or growing into, but also how this data can support in fraud and looking for flags or things to help you with those investigations. So excellent insight. We will be sharing a copy of this, but we do have quite a lot of questions, so I am going to try to prioritize these questions into buckets. And then just so everyone knows, if we don't get to your question, we will follow up, if not tomorrow, by early next week to make sure that we do give you an answer. The first question that we have is for you, Nick, and
okay.
One of the questions is around what are some tips that you have for analyzing this data? And one of the attendees asked, what patterns would you use to identify branches that do not share the same name with the head office?
Yes, good question. So as you will have seen, our method does depend upon similarly named branch and parent. Nevertheless, as you've seen, there's at least one gap that we were able to spot. That's on a spot check basis. We do see a minority of cases where there are either a parent that is subtly misspelled or differently spelled from its branch. We also see occasional cases where there are multiple potential parents contending. We're as a human not sure which one necessarily is the correct parent, and also additional cases like the one I just showed a moment ago, where the parent does not appear to exist at all. In those cases, it can be very challenging. Short of asking about the individual cases of the registry themselves, performing this on a large-scale basis can be challenging. We are going to be looking into whether and if we should be improving our entity reconciliation using any kind of fuzzy matching, but of course there are risks there, as we've seen, where lots of similarly named companies exist. Can we confidently make a selection? Can we confidently say it's this that's the parent? If we can, we should, we would want to do that. If we find that challenging, or if an algorithm that we were to develop were not accurate, the risk of a false positive, I think, can be extremely high. And of course, associating a branch to a parent should not be something that we do without a high degree of confidence. So when you're looking at this data analytically, the absence of a parent is anomalous, right? So over 92% of cases, hopefully you should have a parent. I think there not being one should be, maybe if not a red flag, then it should be something that could be followed up with further manual research. You can use OpenCorporates website for that, or all the data, the bulk data that we share, to see whether there's a similarly named one that might work. We're open to improvements, like I said. As I said, the final resort, and obviously the one that will get you the greatest accuracy, because they should have the data, is the registry themselves. And I think for our part, if we're seeing systematic cases where we're not able to match a foreign LLC to parents, and there's a particular trend of it's one jurisdiction or another, we can talk to both and represent the number of cases that we've seen as examples of why that data perhaps could be improved at source. I hope that's went some way towards answering that question.
Yeah, I hope so as well. And then I guess from a org structure, does it matter if this is a question from the chat, does org structure matter if an entity is dissolved, and does it matter who the parent is? So would the branch change, or the way in which we look at those branch relationships become disconnected? Yeah,
so the way that OpenCorporates handles this would be at an entity level, so the actual domestic and the foreign LLC, domestic company and the foreign LLC, if either one of them changes status to inactive or an equivalent status, we would mark that against the record and have their latest status against there. It should not be possible, it legally isn't possible, for the branch to have any legal standing if the parent has gone into administration or dissolved or is not good standing even. Legally, they therefore have no basis that that's to some extent a mark of at best delinquency, at worst possible crime or fraud. So yeah, essentially, if you're seeing gaps, if you're seeing branches where the parent appears to have lapsed, that would definitely be a red flag. If you're seeing instances where simply the branches have ceased to do business, that's slightly different. Anna gave an example of that. That can be quite normal. It doesn't necessarily indicate in and of itself very much. It could merely be that they intend to re-register with a different name in that jurisdiction. It could be that they look to domestically incorporate in that jurisdiction, or there could be a number of other reasons why that might be happening. But yeah, at the very least, if the parent itself is not in good standing, I think that would be a flag of sorts.
Fantastic, thank you, Nick. And actually, Chris, this feeds into a question for you around how does branch data feed into corporate hierarchies and understanding business structures? And is there any sort of way in which they can analyze this against other data sets like the SEC or the FDIC?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think of the branch data, maybe just stepping back for a second, and I'll answer the specific question. I think about branch data as recording business activity. People don't register branches for the fun of it because, I haven't done much, today, so I think I'll register another branch in a jurisdiction. They register them because they're conducting business activity. And I think the real power of this data set is that it is an official record of business activity. And there is there's a lot of potential here for, the combining these three data sets essentially. So one is the legal entities, the other is the data set of business activity and specifically how it relates to those legal entities. And then the third thing is let's say a bank's own records of activity or state's own activity of record of activity. Because, you think about where business activity is being conducted and is there a real legal entity behind it or not? If there isn't, and there's a bank account, then where's the money going, right? That's an interesting thing. If there's activity, but there isn't a record of that business activity, there's significant payments, but there's not records, that's another risk factor, and that's typically maybe conducted through, for fraud or for money laundering and so on. So when you sort of combine the legal entity data together with the business activity record, together with, let's say, payment records and so on, or trade records and so on, you've got actually a really, really interesting data set. I think there's, without going into too much details, and I probably know more about bank branches and the FDIC data than anyone on this, almost anyone on this call would want me to talk about. But I think there's quite a cost in creating a subsidiary in a jurisdiction. Not necessarily the cost of incorporation, but the cost of understanding the laws there, what you're covered by, what it means, how the laws there combine with the other jurisdictions. So there's really quite a cost there in terms of doing it. There's also sometimes a cost in not doing it, but there is a cost there of doing it. And actually some of this branch, I was actually having a conversation with Companies House, UK Companies House, about a week and a half ago about their branch data, because they, for example, might have a Cayman Islands company that's incorporated, a company incorporated in the Cayman Islands that's registered there, about the data they capture and how they see it and so on, and what the potential there is. And so, you don't actually, as a state that is, I don't know, let's say Louisiana, just to take an almost random one, you don't really have any understanding of you don't have a way of grasping that legal entity. You can't enforce it against that legal entity because it isn't in the state. And so there's some quite powerful things which are, as Nick said, are both positives and negatives, branches versus subsidiaries. And then the only other thing to say is that, and how those choices are being made tells us something about the business and about their choices. And then the other thing is just in terms of let's say classic subsidiary information. Well, we know SEC data, the 21K, the Exhibit 21s of the 10Ks are very partial data, and so don't have most of the subsidiaries in there. It's only it's actually the notifiable ones. And so I think this is all part of getting an overall picture of a business and the business activity, both for good and bad, and to understanding the risk of dealing with it, or whether a legal entity is paying the due taxes if they're operating in an area. And I think also, obviously, from things like sales and marketing perspective about those opportunities there. The FDIC one is, or rather there's a, maybe it's being, they're talking about the bank holding company data and the bank branches in that, and they have a slightly different legal standing. Branches is part of this, but they have a slightly different legal standing in that. So I think, in a way, what I'm saying is that there's complexity in all of this. It's not a straightforward thing, and that's why we've really, wanted to explain some of this. Probably we'll do some additional blog posts. We've got some quite interesting graphs about the flow of branches and home companies and how those different states relate. We didn't really seem appropriate or too difficult to show on a webinar. But I think the thing I'd leave you with is just in terms of the complexity is real, but it's an opportunity to really get to the bottom of the businesses that you're dealing with, or your customers are dealing with, or the regulators are dealing with, because that's the thing where the evidence of fraud, of money laundering, criminal activity, or regular business activity, or how the businesses are choosing to structure themselves is really coming through.
Thanks so much, Chris. And just recognizing time, I'm going to ask you one quick question, Nick, because it's an easy one and it's been asked 3 different times. What happens with a foreign LLC when the parent company is from a foreign country or from another country? Do we have that data? So Italy was referenced, South Africa was referenced.
For the purpose of this webinar, we kept it quite US focused. But suffice to say, obviously, a foreign LLC. I didn't actually make this point, but foreign, when the word foreign is misleading, it purely means of a different jurisdiction. Literally, it's under a different jurisdiction. So one state is foreign to another state, not in the sense of geopolitically foreign or international always, but sometimes it is. Sometimes the foreign LLC has a parent that is not only out of state, but out of country, international, and we would reconcile those as well. So those branches, the number of branches that I showed, 12.5 million, that's US and non-US branch data that we have. So yeah.
Perfect. And on that note, we are at time. For those questions that we did not answer, we will make sure to follow up with you. Thank you very, very much for joining the session today. If you have any feedback or other ideas that you would like us to put together content like this for, please email that over, as we'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, Anna, and Chris.